All right, here's a scenario. You've got a fast casual restaurant that opens and the sales numbers are amazing. And the owners are excited to repeat that success. So the question is, where do they open the next location? What demographic groups are causing those blockbuster sales? See, confusing correlation with causation, that is a mistake that happens all the time. How will this fast casual operator know what statistics to follow and which ones are just red herrings? My guest today is here to talk about how we can avoid that big mistake. Today, we're talking with Paul Sill, the head of the Visionary Insights Group at JLL. You're listening to Where We Buy. It's the show where we talk with retail experts and we visit the places where we buy. My name is James Cook. I research retail and real estate for JLL. Welcome, Paul Sill, to Where We Buy.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me, James.
How long has the Visionary Insights Group been around?
So the Visionary Insights Group has been here for about 2 years now. I came on almost exactly 2 years ago to engage with retailers and restaurants and really anyone with brick and mortar interests to use data to make more informed decisions by virtue of creating more sophisticated modeling and predictive analytics. We work across pretty much the whole swath of the industry, from fast food and QSR clients to daycare, to urgent cares, to universities. Anyone that's really doing some kind of brick and mortar real estate and has ideally historically had a bunch of data sitting in their sort of, warehouses that they've collected from whether it was e-commerce history. So for example, we have a large global running shoe company is a client of the Visionary Insights Group, but this, particular running shoe company never had their own retail stores. They were selling basically through, third-party resellers, sporting goods shops, mom and pop shops, et cetera, big boxes, and said, "Hey, we'd like to open our first retail brick and mortar concept under our own sort of brand flag. How do we do it?" Well, that kind of thing starts with, look at all of your internal data that you've collected from e-commerce sales direct to customers, all your sales that you have made directly through resellers or third parties. And that was sort of the origins of the data that we sort of used to help build some predictive analytics to help them understand which, potential new markets would be best suited for them to put their own brick and mortar store in. And they're off to the races now. I think they've got 5 LOIs out, and their first store is slotted to open in about middle of 2026 upcoming.
So with that example, when you what you're creating, it's a model that's forecasting. If you were to put a store here, these are the forecast sales you would expect that store to do?
Exactly. So we're trying to help the retailers get to the number that's most important to them in building pro formas to make a go, no-go decision, right? So every pro forma that they're going to build about a particular potential site, it's going to start with a top line number. You got to have a number at the top of that financial model. And that number is usually revenue. So I need to know what's the gross opportunity this store is going to produce for me in revenue. And then I can flow it through all my expenses and get to my bottom line metrics, my NPV, my IRR, whatever I use to make my go, no-go decision. So we help them get to that top line number with more sophisticated models built from their data and history. So they're not just guessing or taking a swag. We can give them a number that's, got a hard probability of achievement. So, hey, I know I have an 80% probability of achieving this number. Therefore, my risk is approximately 20% if I'm really thinking about risk in that regard. And I can build my pro forma and say, okay, I can make X profit at this revenue number. And I know I've got kind of a very low to moderate risk in doing this unit. And so we help them mitigate risk, manage risk, and really understand risk before they sort of sign that lease and break ground.
Do you ever do this for a brand that doesn't have historical data? Like that example, they had all these online sales and stuff, but can you do it without that historical data?
Not really. I mean, data is the name of the game, right?
Yeah.
So If you're a relatively young startup and you've never had a brick and mortar presence, and restaurants are a good example, right? Restaurants don't tend to have the luxury of having done a lot of e-commerce or something virtually before they open a box. Now, that's changing in this day and age of ghost kitchens and delivery data where, some food concepts have basically lived out of ghost kitchens and never had their own brick and mortar presence, but they can mine all of that delivery data that they may have collected by working out of a virtual site or a ghost kitchen and use that to potentially help drive where they decide to open their actual brick and mortar locations. So that's an example where we might have the ability to get some data, but really we need data. Without data, we can't draw any definitive conclusions. We're really just guessing, and we're kind of just, using anecdotal thoughts and evidence of what we think is going to be a good thing for our business.
Your whole deal is about following the data and trying to dispel preconceptions. What happens? Does this ever happen where you're working with a client who has this gut feeling that the data is not supporting?
So, I came up with a tagline many, many, many years ago. And the idea is it's called validate your instincts. Real estate is still very much, day-to-day an instinctual endeavor. And there are plenty of people who are very bright and very data savvy who would still rather just trust their instinct rather than rely heavily or solely on what data is suggesting is correct for them in any given scenario. I like to find kind of that middle ground where they blend. I think you need to have good instincts in real estate, and you can operate on those instincts. Where I think analytics play the greatest benefit is validating those instincts in the standpoint that, hey, listen, if you feel really good about this market and this site, great. You want to run with it, go for it. I can give you data that will at least give you a sense of, what is the data suggesting the real risk profile is here based on data? And does it really match up with what I see in my view of it instinctually? When those two things align, you can feel really confident that you're ready to roll. My suggestion to clients all the time is it's only when they're really different that you should stop and dig in a little bit. If I'm suggesting this could be a really challenging market or site for you, and you're convinced it's a home run, I think you should step back and take a little look at what the data is suggesting and see if you can understand why it's sort of telling you there might be challenges here. Just so that you have some context around what your gut's telling you and why it might actually not be right in this particular scenario. So it is this sort of constant push and pull, and I think where we see clients get into trouble and where we're kind of always having those conversations is the ones who want the data to tell them everything, and they just want the answer. And the truth is, real estate analytics just aren't that refined. We can't model everything that goes into a consumer making a choice in a given scenario. You still have to rely somewhat on boots on the ground knowledge, your history, your instincts. And we always encourage that, but we like using our systems as kind of at least, again, one more data point in that decision-making chain besides your instinct.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the reasons why I wanted to have you back on the show is to kind of dispel myths and talk about, different ways that we can think about site selection and data. And we kind of talked about this idea at the top of correlation versus causation, which I think a lot of people have heard of, but set this up for us.
So, there's this sort of anecdote that for years has kind of always made me chuckle. And it goes, to, given that this is like the 25th anniversary, 50th anniversary of the Jaws movie, like we're reaching some pinnacle of the original Jaws, impacting all of our lives. So it's a perfect anecdote given the timing. But the anecdote goes like this, and that is that there was this East Coast study that was conducted that happened to be done over the course of many summers in collection of data over the summers. And it came to determine that if you ate ice cream, you were more likely to be bitten by a shark. So there you go. If you interpret that result, you might believe that, well, shark attacks are correlated with ice cream consumption. Therefore, if I don't eat ice cream, I'm going to be okay. I won't get bitten by a shark when I go in the water. And of course, that's not really the case. But in certain data contexts, as we correlate and work to analyze data that's collected, if we don't apply some context to that data and we just take the correlations we see between two data points on face, we might run away with that assumption, which is ice cream and shark bites are highly correlated. It turns out they're not at all. There's no causation between the two. The reason we see the data correlating is that, during the summer months on the East Coast, everyone's out having ice cream, lots of people are in the water, and shark bites just happen more during the summer months when people happen to have also been vacationing with their families and having ice cream at the beach. So, you can see strong correlations between data points, but they don't necessarily indicate real meaningful causation. And that's always the pitfall and caution we try to get retailers to understand as we're constructing models for them. And as we're also kind of taking their own instincts and their own expectations of what they think drive their business into consideration as we're building models for them. So there is a real delicate art to building good models that are both mathematically correct and can be interpreted in a way that actually makes sense to us in the context of how we're using them.
What's an example of a shark attack and ice cream in the retail world? Like, what's a correlation that doesn't necessarily mean causation?
Usually it happens around site-specific attributes. And we all know that site quality is going to matter in some way, shape, or form. But exactly how a site is determined to be good or better for a given retailer or restaurant than not can manifest in a lot of different ways. So we're always struggling to help clients take metrics like traffic count data. So we oftentimes see, heavy traffic volumes we presume indicate more vehicular traffic on a given road nearby a site. And we would expect there to be, and sometimes we see direct correlation between traffic volumes and performance. One of the interesting relationships we tend to see with traffic volumes, however, is it's the opposite of what we'd expect. What we tend to see as often as not is higher traffic volumes on immediately adjacent roads to certain types of concepts actually ends up being a negative correlate to performance. And it gets our clients scratching their head a lot. And oftentimes we'll get sort of challenged for, how's that possible? You must be doing something wrong. When you dig in deeper and break it down and analyze the data a little more carefully, what we've come to realize is that excessive traffic congestion actually sometimes causes a decline in opportunity dollars because people are actually frustrated and fed up and can't get to your location because there's so much traffic. So we can find that certain metrics that we'd expect to correlate in a certain way won't necessarily show up that way in a model unless we apply, again, some context and interpretation to how that data might actually be working to drive sales. And that's just one example of, what we see sometimes when we're modeling data, specifically around site attributes, because people, again, want to believe and want them and expect them. Their instinct tells them these things should matter and be positive to my performance, but the reality isn't always that way.
Man, I never thought that good, like big traffic counts could hurt your performance, but it makes sense.
It happens. And again, it's first few times it happened. This, of course, 30 years, we've done this for so many clients. And, the first few times we started seeing it in the model, we did have to step back and kind of challenge ourselves on whether we did something with the data. Did we make a mistake in the model? And we often find ourselves identifying these correlations in a client's data, the things that positively affect sales or negatively affect it. And we have to usually step back and really work to sort of interpret what are the two sort of things that we see the correlation between really accounting for. And that's the art part of both model building and model interpretation for retailers, is that just seeing this pattern of, between two data points that's going in a positive or negative direction, we can't just rely on the title of those two data points and what they're showing us. We have to kind of dig into really understanding, what is it telling me? What else is that data perhaps representing in the relationship it's showing me, so I can understand, again, how to interpret it for the client.
I was just talking with somebody who's with a retailer and spends a lot of time, has the sales data and then also uses mobility data from like a third party provider.
Yeah.
And he was like, you you rank our locations by foot traffic, and it can be very different than ranking them by sales. So there's not always a connection between how many people visit and how much they spend.
Yeah. Well, mobile data is a whole nother challenge in today's sort of modeling and predictive analytic world. It's been both a positive game changer. It's certainly a valuable new data point that's becoming more accessible for more clients. But it's also a challenge from the standpoint, a couple different standpoints. When we use foot traffic, so I'm a fast food restaurant, and I now have the foot traffic for all of my restaurants. So I know this restaurant had 100 people last month. This restaurant had 200 people last month. I can, in theory, correlate foot traffic to sales, right? And I can see exactly to what extent that foot traffic seems to be translating to my performance of those units. That's kind of well and good. It's also somewhat self-fulfilling because foot traffic, by definition, represents the expectation that those people are already spending sales. So when we use a variable like foot traffic to predict sales, that's fine. We might see some correlation to sales, and we do for certain concepts with mobile data. It tends to correlate better to sales for concepts that have tighter range of average tickets. So a fast food restaurant's a good example. I walk in there, I'm likely to spend between X and Y dollars. So I can do some basic averaging, and that foot traffic is going to translate to some expenditure. And most people who walk into a fast food restaurant are buying something as well. We don't see it predict as well and have it as direct a correlation to sales for like a big box retailer or another concept where they have either a wide range of potential sales ticket volumes, or a person just as likely to be there shopping or window dressing and not necessarily walk out with anything. So there's a wide spectrum of where foot traffic isn't quite telling me the whole story. But it also becomes only marginally useful for forward-looking predictions. And what I mean by that is, foot traffic, I know it from my existing locations because I can geofence it and I can get that data. But if I'm going to open a brand new box on a corner that's never actually been a fast food restaurant, it's just an empty box, I can't use foot traffic to predict what that box is going to do because I don't know it for that box. So foot traffic becomes really, and this mobile data really becomes relatively useless to us in a forward-looking scenario like that. Because, again, we don't know it for the future box. It's the same unknown as sales. I don't know my foot traffic anymore than I don't know what the sales are. So how do I predict sales for that new box using other variables that I actually can get for both my existing units and this proposed new one? And that's where we, again, rely on geodemographics, social media behavior, competition data, site attributes, all the other market data that we can collect for both existing and new units. And that's what goes into helping us predict the sales volume of that future new store. So that's why mobile data really is only giving us good anecdotal data today on what I have, but it can't really help me with what's going down the road. And there's a lot of other gaps and issues with mobile data that we don't have to go into for this call, but that's kind of how mobile data plays in the bigger picture.
So that's the big, I would say over the past 20 years, that's probably the most impactful new type of data. But we've gotten other new types of data over the years, as long as you and I have been in this business.
Yeah.
Do you think the models are more accurate now because we have better data?
I don't think they're any less accurate or more accurate now. I just think we're able to use different data sources to give us answers that we might have had to use other data sources in the past to effectively serve as proxies for. Having all this great new social media behavioral data, for example, is a really great new data set that's only been on the market for the last couple of years. It's in limited sort of vendor hands, so it's not out there in a big way. So I think that's an advantage just having it because it gives us another way to sort of slice, dice, and try to make sense of a client's data. I don't think we end up with necessarily a better model. I just think we get to the best model maybe through a little bit of a different path by having access to that more unique data. And it might help us dial in certain clients a little better than others. But really, the techniques that we've applied and continue to apply for sales modeling today in real estate are the same techniques that have been around for decades. And everyone wants AI to have some bigger role in predictive analytics for real estate and site selection. But the fact of the matter is, it's really hard for AI to do that kind of modeling because it doesn't have enough data usually to make any kind of meaningful determination using the AI kind of engines that are out there being trained on data. They require tons of, literally terabytes of data to help us make, one decision over another. The problem with retail site selection is the bottleneck really ends up being your own location data and your own sales data. And you usually only have a couple hundred of those or 500 of those or 1,000 of those. Whatever the number is that you have that we're modeling to try to predict for, that's the ultimate bottleneck. And the techniques that work better for that are these machine learning techniques that we apply.
When you mentioned newer social media data, what does that look like?
There's a couple of different vendors that have formed partnerships with, kind of the biggies, right? The Facebook, the Instagram, the X social media channels. And they receive real-time data streams of basically all of that data and activity from those providers. And all that data comes to them effectively geotagged. So they know if I just hashtagged, oh my God, this is the best sale ever, and I was standing at a Nordstrom, that hashtag posted in my social media feed on Instagram ends up in this database that tells me who that person was and where they made that post from. And as a result, I can also see everything else that person was posting or following or doing with social media channels. So I can start to build a profile of this consumer because from that data, I have two really important geotags. I have where they live and I have where they've done these posts from. So with those two really important geospatial components, I can build profiles of where these people are, what their preferences and behaviors are, what brands they tend to follow or have greater affinities for. And that data can be used in models to help us predict whether a Subway is going to do well over here or whether it's going to do better over here in terms of the way people are, hashtagging and demanding access to sandwiches, So that's kind of how that data gets used in our world. We don't have that creepy we're not following you like a dot on a map where I'm tracking your every move. This data gets aggregated and anonymized enough to where, again, there's privacy, measures being taken, but it's low enough of a level of geography that I can do some meaningful spatial analysis on it from a real estate and site selection standpoint.
Does that feed directly into a model or is it more like just directional? I'm just trying to get an understanding of how it works.
So that data, it lives in massive warehouses that we host here, but it makes its way into our models as we build specific models for clients. So let's stay with the fast food example. Fast food chain has 200 locations. I can take all 200 locations. I can generate a social media view of all the markets around those 200 locations. And I can draw some direct correlations between how those units perform and all the different types of social media behavioral activity that's taking place in their markets. And I can see if, the stores that do a little bit better, there is this direct correlation between a particular social media hashtag or feed or preference that's trending on social media and that unit's performance. Then we can scan the whole country at one time, looking for other places where that kind of hashtagging, trending, and behavioral profile tends to exist. Remember, we have behind this social media data, we also have all the geodemographic stuff. So we know that, this group who's hashtagging about these things is the, 20 to 25-year-old female that, happens to have a strong opinion about tofu. And so, we've now identified a strong tofu demand for a new Subway sub for these markets that seems to be doing really well and driving revenue in that particular, sub shop chain or whatever it is. So That's the kind of level of granularity we can get with data, how it feeds the models to help us make forward-looking predictions with it.
And I'm going to predict you're not going to be successful with a tofu sandwich in my area, but maybe somewhere else.
I think you'd be surprised. Tofu's making a comeback.
Okay, Paul. So we talked about shark attacks and ice cream, but that's pretty obvious. But now we're digging into actual retail data. So how do you suggest that retailers who might be listening look at their data and make sure they're not missing correlation for causation?
Real estate and site selection modeling today continues to be a very human endeavor that requires a data scientist, a human being, to be able to look at what the data correlations are showing, apply some meaningful context to it and some interpretation to it. So as we construct a model for a retailer or a restaurant or somebody doing site selection, we can help them make sure that they're interpreting the model correctly and using it to its sort of maximum benefit. And this is again one of the challenges that go back to kind of the whole, why can't AI do this for us? Well, partly it's a data issue, but partly also AI is really good at just finding those correlations and then from those correlations making assumptions. But it doesn't have the human capacity to make sort of the contextual related interpretations of these correlations. The example of the shark bite and the ice cream is a perfect example of the way an AI engine might necessarily see and interpret just raw data. If you fed it a bunch of raw data, that's what it might come back to you, telling you that, well, your business is highly correlated to, ice cream or shark bites, et cetera. So we're trying to give the clients the right result and the best model that can really give them the best predictive result going forward. And again, I still believe, these machine learning techniques and a human being at the wheel is the best way for businesses and clients to kind of avoid this correlation equals causation mistake that can pop up when you're building these kind of things.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you one more question. So, Paul,
Yep.
You teach university classes on this stuff too, right?
That's right. I teach at DePaul University here in Chicago.
Okay. When young students come into your courses, what's the biggest misconception that they have that you have to dispel?
I want the students to be able to think for themselves and leave the class kind of having honed the skill of identifying how to interpret information and use that information in some meaningful way. And that's just a skill that I think, the students are going to benefit the most from long term. It's not just about memorization. It's not just about throwing theories and formulas at them. I really want them to take some data, be able to interpret it, apply some kind of human element to it, and then use it to formulate whether it's what kind of policy should I build or implement to use this data most effectively in an urban planning context, or how can I apply this policy in some kind of environmental context to make sure I'm doing the right thing in that scenario. So I like to really focus on, and that's how we feel like even with JLL, that's what I want our clients to understand is don't expect the analytics to give them the whole answer and don't expect the analytic results to really be absolute, but rather, again, they're guideposts that we can look at and use and apply some meaningful context against to make some good decisions and really mitigate our risk. That's what I think at the end of the day, the models we build for clients are really helping them do is to mitigate their risk.
Excellent. Paul, my key takeaways here are, one, AI is not going to be a solution for this one.
Not in the near term yet. I'm not saying never, but as of right now, it's got some challenges.
And I guess too, it comes out of that. There's no easy answers here. This is complicated stuff without a simple solution.
Yeah, it is. But there are, again, everything we can create is giving a client that much more of an edge on helping to mitigate the risk with every news site they do. And that's the real value, I think.
Awesome. Paul Sill, you head Visionary Insights Group at JLL. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, James. Take care.
Awesome. And if you like this podcast, do me a favor, go into the app that you're listening to right now and give us a rating. Or even better, give us a review. Write a sentence about something that you liked about the show. You can subscribe to Where We Buy on the iPhone podcast app, Spotify, pretty much any podcasting app out there. Just search for Where We Buy and we'll be in it. And you can also find us on the web. We're at wherewebuy.show. If you've got a specific question about retail, shopping centers, retail real estate, feel free to connect and message with me on LinkedIn. Just search for James Cook, JLL. And our theme music is Run in the Night by the Good Lords under Creative Commons license.